Welcome back to the channel, everyone. After what seems like far too long, we're finally back to the world of Mobile Suit Gundam. Today, we're going to be checking out a game that's set in my personal favorite timeline, the Universal Century. This is Mobile Suit Gundam, Climax UC. It's another one of those titles that was released for the PlayStation 2 during the sort of golden era of Gundam games, but unfortunately, it never saw a Western release. That doesn't stop it though from being an honestly pretty great and easily accessible Gundam game, even if you don't speak Japanese. So, without further ado, let's check it out. Let's start off by addressing what would probably be the biggest concern for most people out there. If you're an English speaker, just how accessible is the game? Well, if I had to rank it on a scale of 1 to 10, I'd put it at about a 9. For comparison, another game I covered in the past, Char's Counterattack for the PlayStation 1, another Japan-only release, would probably sit at a 10 on that same scale. Climax UC just has a bit more going on, and while the game does feature a ton of UI and menu elements that are almost exclusively in English, there were a couple times I had to bust out Google Lens on my phone for translation purposes. Instances like this were pretty far between though, so I wouldn't let it deter you from trying the game out. It's very accessible. Okay, let's talk gameplay. The game features 4 primary game modes. Chronicle Mode, which is this game's version of Story Mode, Progress Mode, which is kind of like Mission Mode from Encounters in Space, but better, I would say. It's sort of a pseudo-RPG-like experience. Extra Mode, which features a number of bonus battles to fight and is unlocked after playing through Chronicle Mode, and Versus Mode, which unfortunately seems to only be accessible if you have a friend to play with. At least, I wasn't able to find an option to face off against the CPU, so we won't really be covering this one. Okay, let's talk Chronicle Mode first. As mentioned, this is the game's take on Story Mode. It starts off with the events of the original anime in 0079, and concludes with the events of Gundam F91. Missions are broken up into their respective animes, and then by character, with each character having anywhere between 1 and 8 missions. The original series, 8th MS Team, War in the Pocket, Stardust Memory, Zeta Gundam, Double Zeta, Char's Counterattack, and F91 are all covered. The actual layout of missions in this mode can be broken down like this. After selecting a mission, you get an introduction to the situation at hand via a still image with some scrolling text that's accompanied by narration. Of course, I don't speak or understand Japanese, so unless you do, you may not know exactly what's going on unless you're already familiar with the events of the show. After this, you're given a briefing that again is also fully narrated. From here, you move on to Mobile Suit and Pilot selection. Now, in your first go through the story, you don't have many options here, you have to stick to what you're given, but on subsequent playthroughs, you can choose to bring whatever suit, piloted by whoever you want. You also get the option to choose a skill, which can either be an MS skill, which is a skill that's specific to the mobile suit you're piloting, like Char's Zaku 2's Flying Kick or the Zeta Gundam's ability to transform. Or you can choose a pilot skill, which can be carried over from suit to suit. An example of the latter would be Amuro's skill, which causes your attacks to double in power, while at the same time ignoring enemy shields. Once your mission setup's all complete, it's time to move on to actual mission gameplay. So, what's it like? Well, first of all, I gotta say that I'm a huge fan of this sort of startup sequence effect that plays when you load into your mobile suit, and overall, I really like the HUD design as a whole. It has a nice, fairly minimalist design, and thanks to the geometry of certain HUD elements, it has this nice effect that almost makes it look like you're viewing the screens inside a mobile suit's cockpit. The actual feel of gameplay, moving around, jumping, shifting from target to target, firing weapons, etc., is okay in my opinion. It's far from awful, and I would maybe even consider it to be good, but I don't know, it just doesn't feel as smooth to me as some of the other offerings from this generation of games, like Federation vs. Zeon or Encounters in Space. I think a large part of this is due to the game appearing to have some frame rate issues, with some pretty significant drops appearing at times. When you compare it to the previously mentioned games, The difference is night and day, and I think it's largely to blame for why the combat seems to have a sort of clunky feel to it at times. Again, I just want to reiterate that overall, the gameplay is still solid, but it would have been so much better if it just maintained a bit of a higher frame rate. While we're talking gameplay, I want to briefly touch on controls. I'm going to throw the in-game mappings with an English translation up on screen now, but I think you'll find them overall pretty intuitive, even if there are some minor differences from other Gundam games you may have played. Movement is controlled with your left analog stick, which is self-explanatory. Your locked target can be switched by either repeatedly pressing L1 or by flicking the right analog stick in the direction of the enemy you want to target, and you also have the option to use L2 to break your lock and enter a sort of free look state where you can use your right analog stick to look around. R1 is used to fire your suit's secondary weapons, such as Vulcans. R2 is used to jump or boost yourself into the vertical while on a ground map, but in space it doesn't seem to do anything different than the standard boost input, X, which is used to move around horizontally with your suit's thrusters. Circle is used to activate your suit or pilot's ability, provided you have enough CP points to do so, and Triangle is used for melee attacks. I found that repeated use of melee attacks while multiple enemies were grouped in close together sort of lets you bounce between them as well, so you can take out multiple enemies in a very short amount of time. You can also hold Triangle to charge up a much more powerful melee attack. These attacks do significantly more damage, but I did find them to be harder to land, particularly on bosses or more mobile targets. And finally, Square is used for shooting your suit's primary ranged weapon, and just like with the melee input, it can be held down to charge up a more powerful attack. Depending on what suit you're piloting, these charged attacks can vary pretty greatly, with each one having access to 3 levels of these attacks. As you might expect, each level of attacks gets subsequently more powerful, and these can range from things like gaining access to the Double Zeta's High Mega Cannon, the RX-78's Hyper Bazooka, Gundam Phasalis' Atomic Launcher, or even the New Gundam's Funnels. Which, by the way, New Gundam is absolutely cracked in this game. It's by far been my favorite suit. Once you actually get into missions, they're laid out essentially the same, regardless of what mode you're in. You spawn in, proceed to do things like take out enemies or defend a target, until eventually some form of boss or bosses show up. Notice the plural I use there, because some of these encounters will have you facing multiple bosses in a row. Although, to be fair, in these cases, the enemies you're fighting aren't normally as strong as single target fights. Once you defeat the boss, you'll get a mission complete and see your score for the mission. You also unlock and gain access to collection cards, which can feature things like pilots, units, stages, movies, etc. They help you unlock various things in the game and can later be viewed in the card collection mode. Sprinkled in these levels, you'll find various in-engine cutscenes that will sometimes occur that help progress the mission through whatever situation is at hand. Finales for character arcs conclude with cutscenes that seem to combine both pre-rendered animation and sometimes clips from the anime itself. Of course, all the cutscenes are in Japanese, but I still appreciated them nonetheless. Overall, Chronicle Mode was a decent take on a story mode for a Gundam game, but I think it could have been better. There's a lot that's missed, and if you've never seen the shows, you'd have absolutely no idea what's going on. It could be that I'm missing things that are being talked about in the story setups or briefings by not understanding the language, but I found it to be pretty wild, for instance, that in the story of 0079, the death of Lala wasn't covered, which is arguably one of the biggest events in all of the UC for all the ramifications it has. But on the other hand, 4's death was covered in the Zeta story. So yeah, I'm not sure the reasoning on that, but that's not to say there weren't some highlights though. My personal favorite was probably the encounter between Shiro and Norris Packard from the 8th MS Team show. I don't know if there are any other games that feature this fight, but regardless, seeing it recreated and getting to experience it in video game form here definitely put a smile on my face. After you complete all the mission entries in the mode, you gain access to a bonus mission where you face off against all the show's protagonists on a very, I would call it new type-esque battlefield. Now, Chronicle Mode is definitely not the highlight of this game, and neither is the Extra Missions mode, which seems to just feature extra missions to play through that let you unlock some additional things. The standout here for me, and I'm sure for most folks out there, will be Progress Mode. But before we get into that, I'm excited to announce a brand new partnership with Apex Gaming PCs. With custom-built PCs available in different configurations at various price points, they're sure to have an option for any gamer out there, especially when you factor in their affordable and flexible financing options. Whether you're on a budget and opting for the entry-grade Apex Bronze, or looking to dominate your competition with the Streamer Plus, you can rest easy knowing that your investment is protected by the Apex standard 2-year parts and lifetime labor warranty. For a limited time, you can use my 5% discount code code JARBO at checkout when purchasing. See link in the video description below. Alright, back to the video. So yeah, progress mode. This is one of the best takes on a create your own pilot type mode in a Gundam game that I've ever played. We start off by choosing what side we want to fight for in the 1-year war, and from there, go on to choose what sort of pilot we want to be. We can choose between the following options: gentle, cool, or hot blood. These essentially dictate what our starting stats will look like, but they don't really make a huge impact since we'll get tons of points later on that we can choose to invest in our character how we see fit. Which the 6 attribute points present in the game, not just for our pilot, but pilots across the board, are shooting, melee, defense, mobility, CP points, and new type. Once this initial setup is complete, you get a brief introduction to your squad mates and operators, and then move on to your first deployment, the assault on Jaburo. Mobile suit selection in this mode is limited to the time period and the faction of your choosing, so I went with the Zaku 2 for the first mission, but you'll see that as we progress, more and more options will become available. Actual gameplay in these levels is the same as what we've seen previously, although objectives may vary slightly. Our pilot was able to wipe the floor with Amuro when he showed up, forcing him to retreat despite being limited by the capabilities of a humble Zaku, so pretty impressive. Upon mission completion, you're given a number of AP or ability points to spend that you can then invest in your character as you see fit. From here, you can also choose to, instead of buying attribute points, invest in passive or active abilities too. Although this is one of those moments where you're going to want to bust out Google Lens for translation purposes. From here, our character continues to move forward through the UC timeline, participating in the Battle for Abawaku, the Grips War, the Battle of Axis, and more. At certain key points, you're given even further choices as to what factions you want to fight for. You can choose to fight for the Delaz Fleet or Earth Federation forces during the events of Stardust Memory, the Aug or Axis during the events of Zeta, and Londo Bell or Neo Zeon during the events of Char's counterattack. By the time you're successful at Access, you'll hopefully have built a character that suits your playstyle. I know I found out the hard way that if your character doesn't have enough points invested in the new type, that you simply cannot use funnels that are equipped to certain suits, like the new Gundam that I was attempting to use. So the final fight here ended up being a bit more difficult than I imagined it would be. Now at this point, I thought the mode was over, but it's not. It turns out the actual character creation, where you get to choose your character's name, appearance, etc., doesn't come until a bit later on. After the events of Char's counterattack, our pilot decides to retire, and you're presented with your next big decision. The text on screen here roughly translates to, "This is a generational change event. Depending on who you marry, the pilot abilities that will be passed on to your children will vary greatly. Choose carefully." So yeah, now it's time to choose literally your waifu of choice, and the decision will impact the stats of our next created character, aka your character's child. I ended up choosing Childhood Friend, which the text that we see here roughly translates to a childhood friend waiting for his return to his hometown. All inherited abilities are unknown. From there, we choose our character's appearance and faction, and then proceed to name them, which, yeah, I have no idea when I named my character. The final stretch of progress mode is comprised of 3 missions, beginning in Gundam F91 and culminating with a fight alongside Gundam Crossbone. I focused on turning my pilot into a new type monster that's able to fully utilize the new Gundam to do some pretty insane damage with its funnels. Yeah, this thing is just ridiculous. Funnels are OP in this game. Upon completing your run-through progress mode, you're given a recap of events that took place, and if you take the time to bust out Google Lens and translate it, you'll find that it's pretty in-depth, showing you details of battles you took place in, exactly how many enemies you killed, what suit you were piloting, etc. At the end of the day, I would highly recommend checking out Climax UC. Its gameplay feel may not be the absolute best of the best when compared to some other picks from this console generation, but in my opinion, progress mode more than makes up for it. Let me know your thoughts on the game down below, and as always, thanks for watching. Until next time.